The 1980s were a bizarre and transformative time for the American auto industry. After the high-performance muscle car era of the 1960s and the gas-guzzling land yachts of the 1970s, the industry faced a harsh reality check. Stricter emissions regulations, rising fuel costs, and growing competition from Japan forced American automakers to rethink everything. The result? A decade filled with turbocharged experiments, digital dashboards, underpowered performance cars, and some truly questionable styling choices. It was a period of struggle and reinvention as Detroit tried to adapt to a rapidly changing world. From awkwardly slow sports cars to crazy turbo innovations, here's why the 1980s were the strangest decade for American cars. The death of the classic V8 muscle car. The 1960s and early 1970s were the golden age of American muscle. You had big block V8s pushing over 400 horsepower, cars like the Dodge Challenger, Ford Mustang, and Chevy Camaro dominating the streets, and performance was king. But by the time the 1980s rolled around, muscle cars were nearly unrecognizable. The reason? New emissions regulations and skyrocketing fuel prices forced automakers to drastically cut power. Take the 1980 Chevrolet Corvette, a car that was once a symbol of raw American performance. That year, it came with a 5.0 liters V8, producing just 180 horsepower. To put that into perspective, the 2024 Toyota Camry makes more power than that. Even the legendary Ford Mustang struggled. The 1980 Mustang Cobra came with a turbocharged 2.3 liters four-cylinder engine making 132 horsepower. A far cry from the tire-shredding Mustangs of the past. Muscle cars weren't dead, but they were a shadow of their former selves. The 1980s were a time of downsizing, detuning, and disappointing power figures. The turbo craze. American cars tried too hard. With big V8s struggling under emissions laws, automakers turned to an unfamiliar solution: turbocharging. The idea was simple: use a smaller engine with a turbo to make up for lost power. Sounds great, right? Well, the execution wasn't always perfect. Take the 1980 Pontiac Trans Am Turbo. On paper, it was a great idea. Pontiac dropped a turbocharged 4.9 liters V8 into the Trans Am to replace the old big block engines. But in reality, the car was slow, unreliable, and full of lag. Even though it made 210 horsepower, it wasn't enough to bring back the muscle car magic. Then there was the infamous Buick Grand National. Unlike other failed turbo cars, this one actually worked. The 3.8 liters turbo V6 in the 1987 Buick GNX made 276 horsepower, and it could outrun Ferraris of the time. It proved that American automakers could make turbocharging work, but it took years of trial and error. The 1980s were filled with wild turbo experiments, and while some worked, many ended up being slow, unreliable, or just plain weird. The digital dashboard revolution. If you stepped into a car from the early 1980s, you might think you were in a rejected Star Wars spaceship. The digital dashboard craze was in full swing, and automakers were obsessed with making cars look futuristic. Take the 1984 Corvette. It came with a fully digital gauge cluster, complete with a speedometer, tachometer, and fuel gauge that looked straight out of a video game. It was cool at first, but these early digital displays were often dim, hard to read in daylight, and prone to failure. Then there was the 1983 Ford Thunderbird Turbo Coupe, which had a digital dash that felt like something from a sci-fi movie. But the technology was still in its infancy, and many of these digital dashboards burned out, glitched, or simply looked outdated within a few years. Automakers eventually realized that digital dashboards were more of a gimmick than a necessity, and by the 1990s, most cars had returned to traditional analog gauges. But for a while, it seemed like every car was trying to be a spaceship. The bizarre styling trends: boxy, plastic, and awkward. If the 1950s were all about chrome and fins, and the 1960s were all about sleek muscle cars, then the 1980s were about sharp edges, plastic bumpers, and straight-up weird designs. One of the strangest trends, the obsession with boxy, angular styling. Cars like the Chevy Caprice, Pontiac Fiero, and Chrysler K cars had hard-edged designs that made them look like rectangles on wheels. Then there was plastic. Lots and lots of plastic. American automakers used plastic body panels, bumpers, and trim everywhere to reduce weight and cut costs. The Pontiac Fiero had a plastic body, and the Chrysler LeBaron convertible was basically a box with a plastic front end. And let's not forget the hidden headlights. Cars like the 1986 Dodge Daytona Turbo Z and 1988 Pontiac Grand Prix featured pop-up or hidden headlights that looked cool at night, but often broke down and got stuck in awkward positions. The 1980s had some of the most forgettable designs in car history, but they also gave us some of the most nostalgic cars ever. The rise of Japanese competition. Wake-up call. While American automakers were struggling to adapt, Japan was thriving. Honda, Toyota, and Nissan introduced a wave of small, fuel-efficient, and reliable cars that made many American models look outdated. The Honda Accord and Toyota Camry became bestsellers in the US, while cars like the Mazda RX-7 and Nissan 300ZX proved that performance could still exist without massive V8s. Then there was the Acura Legend, introduced in 1986. It was Japan's first attempt at a luxury car in America, and it showed that reliability and comfort could compete with Cadillac and Lincoln. For the first time, Detroit wasn't the king of the road anymore. Japanese cars had better gas mileage, fewer breakdowns, and smoother designs. This forced American automakers to step up their game, or risk falling behind forever. The return of performance. A glimpse of hope. Despite all the weird styling, slow muscle cars, and turbo failures, the 1980s ended on a high note. American performance cars started making a comeback, proving that Detroit could still build exciting machines. The 1987 Buick GNX was a beast that could outrun a Ferrari Testarossa in a drag race. The 1990 Chevrolet Corvette ZR1, technically a late 80s development, brought back true American supercar performance. And the 1989 Ford Mustang 5.0 finally restored the Mustang's reputation with a powerful and affordable V8. By the end of the decade, it was clear that the dark days of the early 1980s were coming to an end. The luxury cars that were anything but luxurious. If you thought American muscle cars had it rough in the 1980s, wait until you hear about luxury cars. The decade was filled with questionable design choices, underwhelming technology, and some of the most forgettable luxury cars ever made. Take the Cadillac Cimarron, arguably one of the biggest flops in Cadillac's history. In an attempt to compete with European luxury brands like BMW and Mercedes-Benz, Cadillac decided to rebadge a tiny Chevrolet Cavalier, slap a Cadillac badge on it, and call it a luxury sedan. The problem? It still felt like a cheap economy car with an uninspired design and a weak 88 horsepower four-cylinder engine. Lincoln had its fair share of failures too. The Lincoln Continental Mark VI was supposed to be a high-end, tech-filled luxury sedan. Instead, it was a bulky, underpowered, and outdated car that had some of the worst fuel economy in its class. Meanwhile, Chrysler introduced the Imperial, a car that tried to bring back 1950s elegance, but ended up looking like an awkward, squared-off relic. And let's not forget fake wood paneling, the ultimate 80s luxury car feature. If your car didn't have real wood, no problem. Just slap some cheap vinyl wood trim on the sides, and suddenly your station wagon or sedan was a high-end ride. American luxury cars in the 1980s failed to keep up with the smooth, high-quality European imports, and by the end of the decade, brands like BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Lexus had taken over the luxury market in the US. The 1980s were an era of trial and error, wild experiments, and weird designs. American cars went through a rough transformation, losing their muscle, struggling with technology, and facing serious competition from Japan. But out of this chaos came some of the most iconic sleeper cars, digital dashes, turbocharged beasts, and innovative designs ever seen. It was a strange but important decade that shaped the cars we drive today. What do you think was the weirdest part of 1980s American cars? Let us know in the comments. And if you love car history, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more automotive deep dives.